Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for the Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was created by Rebecca, who is an intermediate photographer from Tennessee. Rebecca says she took this in her small home studio. She was working on lighting, posing, and post-processing. She shot this with a full-frame sensor Canon 5D Mark II, f2.8 macro 100mm lens, and exposed the file at ISO 400 f2.8 and 1/200th of a second. And Rebecca also tells us that this is a one light setup. Let's talk about lighting first. We only know that it's a one light setup, but we can look at the shape and direction of the shadows here and also look at the location of the catch lights in the eyes and kind of reverse engineer this and make a pretty good guess that Rebecca's one light strobe is up here somewhere, significantly higher than eye level because of how high the catch light is in the eye. And we also know that the light is definitely moving in this direction from right, camera right, and from high to low based on the shadows. And in a lot of respects, let's say that you're just getting into working with lighting, you would like to work with lighting. If we're going to use a one light setup, and that light is going to be the main or key light for a formal portrait like we have here, in a lot of respects, the placement of the light here is pretty classical. What do I mean by that? Classical placement of a main or key light would mean that, however we have this modified, let's just say it's a real small softbox, that the middle of this light would be slightly higher or significantly higher than eye level. Why is that a classical position for main or key light for a formal portrait? Number one, it's going to mimic the direction of the sun throughout the whole day. The sun's never going to be lower than our face and creating shadows that move up. So it has a natural feel to it based on mimicking the sun is a main or key light. And the other thing that this position of light does, particularly if in addition to being slightly higher than eye level, we bring the light around to one side like Rebecca has, it creates dimensional lighting. So one side of the face is going to be brighter than the other. It's going to be a highlight side and a shadow side. Rebecca has that here. The shadows themselves are going to move in a dynamic way that will imply movement on the z-axis or depth. The other thing about this position for a light is that if we combine that with a camera position where we take the center of the lens and instead of being in the middle of the composition we bring it up to either on par with eye level or slightly higher than eye level, portrait subject will have to look up, and when they look up you'll get what Rebecca has gotten here. You'll get a catch light in the eye and a really nice quantity of light overall in the eye. In addition to all the things I've already talked about, I really like this position for the main or key light relative to what it's doing in the torso of the portrait subject here. The dress is not a simple dress in terms of the way the fabric is hanging. It's complex, and the direction of the light here is showing that. It's showing us highlight and shadow and highlight and shadow, and there's a lot of feeling of dimensional lighting in the lower part of the shot, and I think that works really well. There's something I might want to change about the lighting setup, or maybe a variation. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's talk about some basic posing things. There's a couple of real classical things happening here in terms of posing, and they're working together really beautiful here in a real classical way. When it comes to the face is slightly turned. When we talk about formal portraiture and guidelines, we could talk about shooting straight on, and then we could talk about starting to turn the head relative to our camera position. If we turn it a little bit, we'll see more of one ear than the other. If we turn it more, we'll only see one ear and we won't see the other. That's 3/4, 7/8. And it looks like this is close to a 3/4 pose. Hair is covering this ear, but it almost looks like the face is turned far enough where we might not see that far ear at all. Turning the head like this is sort of classical because it starts to push towards something that is dimensional. We're only going to see one ear or more than one ear than the other. One eye is going to get closer than the other, and that'll be dynamic. We'll see more of one side of the face and more of the third dimension of the face. And so having the head turned a little bit is classical, and also having the torso turned a little bit is classical. One shoulder here is a little bit closer than the other. That means one is a little bit bigger or higher than the other. And Rebecca, either consciously or not, has set this up in a very classical way. Head turns and moves so that the energy is coming in this direction. Torso is turned so that there's a feeling of movement in the opposite direction. Very classical. So I wanted to mention that in terms of posing. The other thing that I enjoy here, and to me what is a portrait that's a lot about beauty, A beautiful model. The lighting is open, even though there's one light and there's direction to it. We're lighting in a way where we're seeing most of the features of the face in the same way. This real soft, sort of direct gaze, almost the beginning of a smile, I think, in terms of gesture and expression, works really well with what's happening, all the other things that we have talked about. When it comes to changing this, very basic takeaway today. It's something that I talk about every once in a while on the Daily Critique, but it's been a while since I've mentioned it. And I just want to say I think this is a real simple thing, but it could be a very powerful creative tool for you in your photography, and that is the idea of thinking about exposure from a creative standpoint. You know, if we're shooting landscapes or we're shooting architecture, shooting scenes that are more literal, it can be difficult to take the exposure and make a radical departure from exposing for some things in a normal way, because we'll have so many different subjects, so many things are sort of tying us into this box of reality that can be much more difficult to just dramatically, intentionally under or overexpose. Let's say things that are sort of medium bright in a given scene. But when we start to simplify and we are just shooting one subject against a background, or we're shooting still life or food or a product, then to me we have a lot more leeway. We can tend to think of portraiture and we can tend to say, well, I at least have to expose the skin in sort of a normal way. And I feel like that is what is happening here. I'm not saying that's the dialogue Rebecca had with herself, and I'm saying to me the exposure is such that if I were to see this portrait subject or model, that the way I'm seeing her skin from a luminance standpoint and a value standpoint now would be very similar to how I would perceive it if I just ran into her on the street. But the thing is, we don't have to be tied into that, particularly in portraiture, particularly in sort of glamorous or fashion or beauty portraiture. And one of the reasons that we could say that we don't have to be tied into that is just from a creative standpoint. We can do whatever we want. Another is that in the last 10, 12, 15 years, portraits have pushed more towards being keyed towards very bright values, particularly in the world of beauty. So we could take skin and we could make it much brighter than it looks to our eye. And so I'm really just trying to drive home a simple point today, that you can be very tempted because of your digital camera when you hit the play button and you get a histogram to only think about exposure in terms of getting it correct or getting it right or staying within the histogram or exposing in a way where you can do your best Photoshop work. And I want to try and encourage you sometimes to get way away from that, to intentionally radically under and overexpose, whether you're doing it in the camera or whether you're doing it in post-processing. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to turn on a group of layers, just a few layers, where I essentially just opened up the exposure by about 3 stops. And the reason there's more than one layer in here is that I also changed the background to blue to create even more depth. But this is what is essentially sort of hiding in this scene if we were to, at the level of the camera, overexpose it by 3 stops. And there it is. I did change the color of the background. There was almost no blue back there at all. So I did add color to create more of a feeling of depth. But if you just look at the model's face and you look at the model's dress and you look at the skin, it's clear that the skin is very overexposed in some places here. But we could get away with that here. I feel like we could definitely get away with it. And we have created a variation that you may or may not like, but it has a very different effect on the viewer in terms of how they move in this image, where they look, and how they feel about the portrait subject. And it may be hard for you to do this in the camera if you're tied into the idea of your exposure having to have a connection to at least some important subject in terms of the reality of that subject. I am asking you today in the strongest possible way to take time in your creative process to get away from that. Creative exposure is one of the simplest and one of the most powerful ways that you can start to push away from what you're seeing and see the world in a whole new way. You might give yourself a real simple exercise. Go to a place that you've been to before. It'd be really neat if it's a subject-rich environment where you can shoot all kinds of things, small things, large things, scenes, flowers, maybe a city walk in a city where you live that has everything from architecture to people to maybe even a park nearby. And just for 1 hour, radically overexpose everything you shoot. Look back at the scene, look back on your LCD, so on and so forth, and start to try and get your mind around the creative potential of overexposure. Then you could go out and play around with the same thing in terms of underexposure. I want to say a big thank you to Rebecca for giving us the opportunity to talk about exposure today. This just happened to be an image that I think has a good variation hidden in there if we overexpose. But what I love about this portrait to begin with is not about that at all. It's about great use of a one light setup. It's about classical posing here that works really well. I didn't mention this yet, but really nice color. I love the red with this model's coloring. Red plays very well with black and white, and really great expression. Beautiful portrait. I want to say a big thank you to Rebecca. I want to say a big thank you to you for being here. Hope to see you again soon on another episode of the Daily Critique.